Okay, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a theoretical introduction here, and then we're going to pass over to our guest speakers. So I'm going to set the context, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the donor context and also the multilateral institutional context. There's a lot of history in discussing and working on the transition from humanitarian to development assistance. A lot of movement, and I'm afraid not very much progress. In fact, just coincidentally, back in the early 80s, I was involved in the very beginning of this with ICRA in Africa, which was during and then just after the African famine. There was already at that time a big initiative to try to build development solutions into the displacement of that period. Since then, there's been a succession of special initiatives and resolutions and programming approaches that get renewed about every 5 years. So this is a long cycle, and we're in another cycle right now. So I'm not going to repeat the whole cycle, but I'm going to sort of fast forward to the current context, and I'm going to talk first of all about the humanitarian side. After the tsunami in 2005, there was a big moment of humanitarian reform. Many of you who work in humanitarian assistance will know all about that. That developed what's called the cluster approach, and within that, the creation of what's called the early recovery cluster. So there's actually a specific humanitarian coordination and financing mechanism for early recovery after disasters built into the whole 2005 cluster system. Fast forward a bit further, in 2011, UNDP, the World Bank, and UNHCR got together to develop what they call the Transition Solutions Initiative, which was an attempt to try to broaden solutions for displaced people beyond UNHCR. Focusing in particular on ending protracted displacement situations. They had some case studies, East Sudan and Colombia. And Colombia, by the way, to my knowledge at least, is really the only successful protracted displacement situation which is moving towards a solution. So Colombia is a particularly interesting case study. In 2011, the Secretary General of the UN made a decision, it's kind of like a decree, that all of the UN agencies had to play nice and work on the humanitarian to development transition. And this was known as the Secretary General's decision, and a number of programming and coordination mechanisms came out of that. If you look up the Secretary General's decision of 2011 in Google, you'll see the text. It's a 2-page memo, and it basically sets out a UN coordinating framework. Fast forward again, in 2013, there was a roundtable organized mainly at that point by UNHCR in Amsterdam to try to bring governments, donor governments, host governments, NGOs, and UN agencies together. It was called the Amsterdam Roundtable, and most recently there was an event in Copenhagen 2 months ago called where an initiative was launched called the Solutions Alliance. So the Solutions Alliance is the current sort of prevailing multilateral coordination initiative, bringing together, again, NGOs, NGOs from the south, NGOs from the north, multilateral agencies, donors, and host governments. And that's an initiative focused specifically on trying to end protracted displacement, essentially moving displaced populations from a humanitarian phase to self-reliance and eventually towards development. That's the humanitarian track. On the development track, quite typically, there's like the humanitarian track and the development track are working separately. So on the development side, the current situation is that there's significant work was carried out in 2010, 2011 by the International Network on Conflict and Fragility, and I see that you've printed out some of their stuff here.
Due diligence.
INCAF. INCAF is the group which focuses on the donor side on coordinating the humanitarian to development transition on the development agency side. They produced in 2012 a very important document called Guidance on Transition Financing, which essentially is advice to donors on how they should plan and allocate their money so that we can bridge the gap between humanitarian and development financing. The DAC work and the INCAF work fed into the Busan conference. You all know about Busan. And at Busan was launched a thing called the International Dialogue. And the International Dialogue is an annual ministerial process of states, conflict-affected and fragile states and donor states to work together on their humanitarian to development transitional problems. Related to the international dialogue is a thing rather confusingly called the G7+. I don't think there's any members of the G7+ who are actually members of the G7. It's a different group of countries. It's a group of fragile states. And coming out of that was a thing called the New Deal. These are all terms. If you look it up in Google, you'll see New Deal, G7+, international dialogue. This is a whole development stream, all coming out of INCAF and Busan. So those are the two streams of work which are taking place right now in the multilateral and in the bilateral donor sphere. So, why have they not made much progress? Well, I'd like to venture 3 reasons. I can think of many more, but I'll just start with 3. The first is that in many displacement situations, the host governments are uncooperative. Particularly if it's a refugee situation, often there's an uncomfortable, sometimes antagonistic relationship between the host government and the refugees. So it's not easy to do. And the ideology of DAC aid effectiveness says that the country is in the driver's seat. So if the country is in the driver's seat and then the country is not interested essentially in diverting what could be development resources for their country to help a displaced population which is in their country, then you get a stalemate. The second problem is that actually humanitarian to development transition is really very difficult. And we can't I think, hide that from ourselves, and not a reason to give up, but it is difficult. It's difficult because development in the conventional sense that we use most commonly, it needs stability and it needs a responsible government. And these are not conditions that you find in fragile states. Because it's difficult, donors are risk averse, donors do not want to, essentially they fear failure, so they would rather invest in safer things than this messy, difficult, sometimes politically fraught transition from humanitarian to development assistance. The third reason, I think this is actually a big one, is that the donor agencies, and DFAT-D is a good example, but not the only one, are wired all wrong for joining up the development and the humanitarian sides of their work. Quite typically, there are actually 2 different parts of the agency. In some governments, the US is a good example, there are actually different departments of government responsible for humanitarian and development assistance. So different ministers entirely, not just different parts of the same agency. These 2 parts do not communicate well. They've got different drivers. Humanitarian agencies, donor departments are driven by humanitarian principles, which you know, and the development partners are usually driven by other geopolitical national interest factors, which may not align with humanitarian factors. You see this very clearly in a place like Pakistan. And so the fact that donor agencies are wired wrong with the humanitarian side that doesn't talk to the development side is, again, demonstrated by what I described to you just now as being the different processes, the humanitarian process and the development process at the global level, which still are not really properly connected. I've got just some final comments to make here about differentiators between different kinds of humanitarian emergencies, which might help us get our heads around this question of the transition. And I think that this actually plays quite well to the case studies we have with us today in Philippines and South Sudan, because they're kind of prototypes of the 2 different types of humanitarian problem in some ways. So, the type of the humanitarian emergency is an important factor. If it's a natural disaster or a conflict, drought and famine is somewhere in between the 2, one might argue. In a natural disaster, the disaster is sudden, there's a huge amount of public support. That is where most of the private fundraising comes in. I know that the Canadian Red Cross raised, I think it's $46 million for the response to the hurricane in the Philippines. We all know how much was raised for the response to the earthquake in Haiti. So you get a huge amount of money, a lot of private individual donations, which drives a lot of individual NGO actors into these natural disaster situations. And that changes the character of the players on the ground as well. Also, with a natural disaster, you have a clearer progression from an emergency to a recovery to rehabilitation to development. You can see a line of sight between what one might characterize as different stages along a continuum. In a conflict, it's nothing like as clean as that. Conflict emergencies are messy. You get they often evolve quite slowly, and then they suddenly accelerate, and then they stop. You have problems of humanitarian access, which are quite unique to conflict emergencies. You nowadays have a lot of concern around humanitarian worker safety that didn't used to be a question 20 years ago, but now it's become very important. The state is usually a protagonist in conflict emergencies, which completely changes the way that you work in that country. Often the underlying causes of these conflicts are very deep. Displacement is hard to reverse, and the whole situation is way more political, both on the donor and the agency side. So again, conflict emergency has a quite different set of characteristics from a natural disaster. A second differentiator between two different types of emergencies, we see this again with Philippines and South Sudan, is the underlying capacity and the context of the country or the region that's affected. Again, with BOFA, do you call it BOFA or do you call it Yolanda?
Yolanda, Haiyan.
Yeah. You call it BOFA, okay. With BOFA or Haiyan, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can tell us why it's BOFA and Haiyan. You've got a strong state that's highly organized with a well-developed national emergency response system. Philippines, by the way, is the only country in the world that's actually made the UN cluster system part of its national disaster management legislation, which is pretty remarkable in some ways. So they're really right there in the sort of, in that kind of highly organized humanitarian space. On the other side, you have South Sudan. In the left corner, you have South Sudan, which is, stressed and pulling apart and falling apart, and at so many different levels, with so many levels of complexity. And Jim will get into that in a moment. Third major characteristic, which separates two different types of emergencies, is whether they are IDPs or refugees. As soon as you've got refugees involved, then a different legal framework and a different set of agencies gets involved. If they're IDPs, then the legal framework is different, and you tend to get different agencies involved. Again, South Sudan is a very interesting case, because in the South Sudan you've got refugees and IDPs. There's a few countries like that. Afghanistan is another. Pakistan is another. And so there's a lot of complexity and coordination in situations where you've got refugees and IDPs. Finally, another big difference between different types of emergencies, partly because it's natural or not, is the extent of media interest, the extent of strategic interest by donors in those countries, and the extent of diaspora interest. The Philippines is, again, interesting because we've got a high level of diaspora interest. The countries of strategic interest in Asia, but also to many countries in the West, a lot of media interest. Contrast it with South Sudan, where there's hardly any media presence, and what's there is highly limited in what it can observe. Really, a very little strategic interest to anybody except the Sudanese and China. And again, no significant diaspora interest. So you get a different window on an emergency depending upon whether it is, highly visible, mediatized, and diaspora-driven, or whether it's not. So these are some of the big characteristics which differentiate, in my view at least, between different types of emergencies, and that explain some of the difficulties in transitioning from the humanitarian to the development space. So that's it for my my introduction. I hope that that wasn't too much right after everybody had their lunch. And I'm now assured that Jess is going to wake us all up. So
I'll try. Good afternoon. My presentation will be in about 3 parts, although it won't be really that organized and logical as Julian was saying, to really share with you this transition, this continuing, this integration is a very complex issues. So I'll try, where I'm coming from, I'll try to share with you my own personal experience. My first exposure of humanitarian disaster was actually in Cambodia, but we only came in later when the UN was setting up its operation. But then the real on-the-ground experience was East Timor. I guess you call that a conflict, humanitarian disaster. So I was there during the scorched earth withdrawal of the Indonesian government, and then when the international forces came in, led by Australia, and so on and so on. Then the 2-year transition to the independence, where we're trying to not actually rebuild, but build a new nation and a new society emerging from that complete destruction. So that was about in 2000. Then 5 years after that, the tsunami came, and in those countries we were already involved in Sri Lanka, to a certain extent India, and then of course Aceh. So I went there with our emergency team a few weeks after the tsunami disaster, and they were still pulling bodies, almost 1,000 a day. So every time, even now, whenever I see garbage bags on the corner and the dump trucks, it reminds me of that experience. And from then on, and incidentally, that was 10 years ago, where will be there are a number of events that's being organized to commemorate and also to look at some of the lessons learned. Then this superstorm came in, so that's about a gap of 10 years, because I'm coming more from the development perspective. So that's again my first time after 10 years to be exposed in the humanitarian environment, or I would say humanitarian culture of responding to a disaster. So what I'll try to do is share those experiences, and the question that we have inside the organization is, what have we really learned? And we asked these questions when we were starting to draft our strategy for reconstruction in the Philippines. And that's also not just in the institution, but in our what we call Caritas network. Caritas network, and probably I'll do a little bit of explanation. It's almost equivalent to the Red Cross network, and was created right after World War II to respond to the World War II rehabilitation and so on. And it's quite a huge network, and when there's a disaster, we organize a common appeal, what we call emergency appeal, and then 150 agencies would contribute to that, including Caritas Bangladesh and so on. And sometimes, depending on the capacity of the local organization, we provide what we call the emergency assistance team to help the local organization. And that's exactly what we did. The third part, or the second part of my presentation would be on exactly what we're discussing now. That creative tension, and sometimes damaging tensions between emergency, recovery, rehabilitation, and development. And also the challenges when humanitarian aid is now an industry, a big business, and that challenges of trying to bridge short-term and long-term needs of the survivors, and long-term issues that sustains systemic vulnerability. And then also the issues that, again, keeps on coming out during my visit in the Philippines, this disaster capitalism that Naomi Klein was talking about, and even the militarization of disaster. As you probably know, the Americans are very much involved in the emergency assistance, but at the same time, it was also in the context when China was claiming some of the islands around the area where the disaster actually happened. Then I'll end with a good part of that on our on-the-ground practice and how we struggled, how we tried our best to integrate the development part in the emergency. And I have this fresh from the ground, the illustration on the working group that was trying to integrate community organizing in the reconstruction and development. Development and peace has been involved in the Philippines for about 2 decades now, and we have about 10 long-standing partners for about 10, 15 years. So this is, we describe this relationship as historical patience, knowing that development is a long term. And the key challenges, even before this Yolanda disaster, was on the development issues: poverty, inequality, powerlessness. On the humanitarian side, we have the country. I actually have a PowerPoint, so I have many points, but I don't have power. No? And I want to. There are so many pictures that I wanted to share with you, but that's okay. So in my slides here, there's the map of the Philippines that totally in red, and some parts in yellow, meaning it's in a conflict area. You know, in the south there is the separation movement, the Muslim National Liberation Front, and about a month or 2 months ago there was a peace agreement that was agreed upon. Then there is also the issue of climate change. So when the Yolanda disaster happened, in fact, there was a conference that was happening somewhere in Europe, and the representative of the Philippine delegation appealed to the Western world to do something about it. And he actually was in tears because his community was also destroyed. And he, in fact, launched a hunger strike to pressure the Western world. So even before that, there has been a lot of discussions and actions on the side of our regular partners in development. Our program in the Philippines is, the development program is to contribute on the emergence of alternative models and practices of development in order to reduce. So again, we have that already in mind. And then, bang, the Yolanda happened. And I don't want to have to go through the extent of the disaster, but it's the worst natural disaster in its recent history. And the devastation also brings back memories of the tsunami in 2004. And I kept, at the early days of the Yolanda disaster, the media was interviewing me, and I keep on using the comparison that it's like the tsunami. But then the comparison stops there because, for example, in Aceh, the tsunami came in and then it stops about 25 kilometers from the shoreline. And of course, there's a complete devastation. But in the case of the Philippines, we're talking about 44 districts, 12,139 villages, 591 municipalities, and 9 regions. So in the context of the church structure, that's equivalent to the 9 dioceses, or in fact 13. The other ones withdrew from the appeal because they think that the 9 dioceses are much more devastated. And the entire coastal villages completely was away. And I explained this, imagine the whole of Toronto completely devastated. And that's about 5 million people that were displaced and so on. So I don't want to get into the details of that. And so in March, I tried to trace the path of the destruction, but I did it in reverse. And I have seen it in videos, in pictures, and so on. And last Saturday, I was telling the group that I tried to take as many pictures as possible and try to relate the extent of the destruction, but not a single picture would have captured it. You really have to be there to imagine the staggering extent of the destruction. And as usual, our response, we did the emergency food sourcing, distribution of food basket, shelter, NFIs, the non-food items, wash, and then psychosocial support, the traditional response. Then inside the organization, we immediately said we need to hire a person for this emergency. We need to look at our 2-year plan and so on, and a big debate in the organization. So what will happen to our development program? Did we really learn from the Mitch, from East Timor, and most recently Haiti? And it also brought back memories of when I was first in East Timor. There is really a totally different world, the world of the emergency, and they know each other. They have built their family and so on. They have been in Afghanistan, they have been in Cambodia and so on. And it's a culture. It's the same thing in the tsunami. It was one big circus. The entire hotel was booked by this and that organization. And when we came in, we could not find any hotel. We have to stay in the churches. Again, same people that you saw in the emergency. And I'm saying this without any malicious comment. I'm just saying it's another world. And then I'm on the development world, and the language, the words are essentially very different. Then you see all this new Land Rover, and it's quite sophisticated. And I'm really, 10 years after the tsunami, I was so impressed on how the logistics are immediately put in place, the coordination, all these clusters and so on. Even in the organization, we always say that, when you ask the emergency officer that we have to leave on Sunday, immediately the emergency officers would go. The ticket would be bought, and there you go. And you ask the development officer, and the development officer said, well, I really can't go. I have a dentist appointment on Monday. And so that's a totally two different world. And I'm sharing this as a very personal experience, why inside the organization we have that kind of tension. So the way we resolve it is by asking me that I would be responsible for both the emergency and reconstruction and development, because the way we are structured in the organization is all the proposals, all the plan is approved and processed by the emergency team, and then all the development program is approved and processed by the development team. So as you can see, and that's still the structure in the organization, so it's very hard to even, at that micro level within the institution, it's so hard to integrate. Then as we move on, this whole debate that we have, the disaster militarism that our partners were saying, when you look at the highway from Tacloban later, and that city was completely destroyed, and then the ground zero to Samar, there's a beautiful highway constructed by USID. And thanks for that, the flow of emergency aid became quite efficient. But at the same time, people are wondering why, in that isolated area, and it's a bit scary to cross that area because, for one, it's summer used to be until now as the what do you call that, the most that's the strongest guerrilla base for the New People's Army. And then also from Giwan all the way back to Leyte, that's also excellent highways that was constructed by the Americans. This whole disaster militarism came out again because they found out that there is this airstrip that Hercules plane could land, and that used to be the airstrip during World War II. People were saying that Douglas MacArthur actually landed there first rather than in Leyte for refueling. And now the Americans are actually talking about it, and then the latest agreement with the United States was actually a secret. No? Nobody knows whether the reconstruction of the new military base will be in that area, because there's a lot of confidential agreement that happened. Again, I'm mentioning this just because these are some of the issues that are coming out in the discussion on the reconstruction. Then there is the disaster capitalism. The question is, where has all the money gone? And ask desperate people from Baghdad, New Orleans, from Kabul to the tsunami-struck Sri Lanka or Indonesia. One place, and a great deal of it has gone into major capital expenditures for these private contractors, largely under the public radar. Billions of taxpayers' dollars have been spent on the construction of a privatized disaster response infrastructure. For example, in Indonesia, the debate was no longer on whether it will be a cement or asphalt for the highways. The question was whether it will be gold or bronze. Kind of how, because there's so much money and there's so many construction companies wanting to do that. And then this whole rapid fire corporate re-engineering of societies is still reeling from the shock. And that's already happening also in the Philippines. No? And I'll give an example of that. So with that situation, ironically, in our organization, we really see this as an extraordinary opportunity to redress the conditions that made poor people so vulnerable. The area where the Yolanda's or Haiyan is the international code. Yolanda is the local name. And in the past, it's all women's name. No? But now they started with A to Z. So as you can see, Y means that there were so many typhoons that happened over the year. No? And the Philippines is visited by an average of 20 typhoons. So we were in the Y. The Philippines was in the Y. That's why it's called Yolanda. 4 out of 10 families were already living below the poverty line. And the bulk of this relied on a small-scale farming, fishing, low-paid jobs, or small business to survive. And for us, it's the time to really replace an unjust social and economic arrangement with new, just, risk-reducing socioeconomic, cultural, and political structures and institutions. The good thing about the Yolanda, and people describe it like it's a person that visited the country, because it really, once again, unraveled. It opened up all these age-old colonial questions, and as you can see, the whole questions of why the reconstruction is so slow was the conflict between the clan family. That area, the ground zero, was actually the town of Imelda Marcos. And the mayor is still the relative of Imelda Marcos, Romualdez. And when the disaster came, the head of the local government was Rojas, another landlord. And of course, the president of the Philippines is Aquino. So it brought up again this old colonial feudal arrangement in the country, and that's why it's very important for us to address that. I'm okay. Yeah. So when we were crafting our reconstruction program, we really want to address the vicious cycle of chronic poverty and disaster by supporting initiatives that will diversify livelihoods, ensure secure land tenure, implement just and viable relocation and resettlement. That's so easy to say because the permanent, temporary, transitional shelter, can you see the contradiction there? That's how many humanitarian organizations are describing their shelter program. Permanent, temporary shelter. Because in a very sophisticated manner, many of the humanitarian organizations will not start to build the shelter unless there is a certificate of land occupation. And as you can see, many of the people don't own the land. But in terms of the Spears guideline and so on, you really have to make sure that people are allowed to settle in that area. And a good part of that, people have to negotiate with the landlord. And in a rush to really, again, as I was saying, this trying to bridge this short-term and the long-term issues is as difficult as it can be. And so most of the people would get 1 year and 2 years, and then we have this CIDA or DPAT guidelines that it has to be really typhoon-proof, earthquake-proof, and so on. But after 1 year, what do you do with that? So we have to, to establish this thing that attached to the cement that when when we have to move the people, we just have to detach it and so on. So it becomes a permanent, temporary, transitional shelter. Okay. The 4 programs that we have, again, I'll do it quickly. Instead of calling it shelter, we're calling it sheltering, meaning that shelter is only an entry point to that. And the second component is instead of calling it livelihood, we're calling it rebuilding local economies. Livelihood is not simply to distribute seeds, to buy boats, and so on, but you actually look at it in the context of how you can sustain the local economies. So it's not simply transferring economic material and so on. And then instead of saying, okay, we need to provide water, health, sanitation, or WASH, we said we want to build communities that's healthy and that's able to access the basic resources. And instead of just saying, okay, multilateral agencies and the government should coordinate with international organizations, we said no, the people should be the center in the planning, in determining the master plan for the rebuilding of the devastated communities. We call it, again, increasing the democratic space of the people and what we call the citizens' participation. The illustration that I have with you here, the figure 1, I'm so sure for most of you were involved in the humanitarian. It describes, again, the dilemma that we face. On top is the time frame. I described that as well, the short and the long term. The traditional framework is what we call the continuum from relief, rehabilitation and development, and what we call the modified framework or the integrated framework that you actually as you do your sustainable development, like what we do in development and peace, we actually don't even ask those questions about the disaster preparedness, reducing the hazards of the people. It's not even integrated in our plan. So this Yolanda is really an opportunity for us to bring that together. It's a big challenge for us. The illustrations below on the figure 2 is in the second appeal of the Caritas agencies. We were pushing for the actual integration of community organizing. Because the centerpiece of our program in the Philippines is actually community organizing. Sometimes we call it capacity building, but the approaches of many of our partners is community organizing. And our working group in the country tried to frame that, because when I was explaining that to our Caritas network, in many countries, the emergency, the Caritas, and development are actually separate. In Germany, we have the Miserior, the biggest development agency, but we also have Caritas Germany. In France, we have Secours Catholique, but there is also a development organization called CCFD. But in Canada, we're able to bring the two together. But operationally, inside the organization, we are still quite separated. So when we had a discussion with our partners, as you can see on figure 3, the key issue is how do we, the result of community organizing at the level of the different organizations, the Caritas International, the Caritas Philippines, the Diocesan Social Action Center and Parish. And then you engage the national government, the LGUs, the local government, from province to barangay. So if the people are quite organized, you say that you try to translate that, you try to transmit some of the issues. For example, the no-build zone, where many coastal communities are not allowed to build houses in that area. And the government actually compromised, and the compromise is that it's now called no dwelling zones, meaning those areas will now be for commercial purposes. So many of the people who are in the temporary tents are now being, the former owner are asking those people to leave, because they also want to have the piece of the pie. Again, the do no harm thing. You try to lobby the government to change the kind of generic order that there should be no build zones. Now there's no dwelling zones, so the disaster capitalism coming into the picture and removing the entire communities and moving them for about 20 or 2 hours away from the coastal communities. And the most important is on the scales of participation, because when I discuss this with many humanitarian organizations, and even with our counterpart like the Catholic Relief Service, the so-called beneficiaries they participate in the selection of the most vulnerable and so on. They call it social preparation. And then there's the social mobilization to ensure that the proper people are actually selected, the most vulnerable. And I actually met them, single mothers, senior citizens, handicaps, the elderly, and so on. But the process itself is on the scale of 1. They are informed beneficiary. So what we are hoping is by integrating community organizing, because it's an incredible missed opportunity. You have already gathered the most vulnerable. You have clusters of livelihood, but you stop there and you said, well, it's up to the people if they want to be organized. That's on our exit strategy. But the most urgent, critical thing that we need is to reach out to the most vulnerable, give them temporary shelter, and eventually transition house, and that's it. But for us, the way we define it, the way we integrate the development side, is that the people actually are the ones taking the initiative. They are the co-planner, they're the co-implementer, and they're the co-evaluator. And that's actually what we did in tsunami. Within 2 years, and Julian can attest to that, we were able to succeed in building 3,800 houses, but also 28 local organizations, which until now exist in a situation where it was isolated for 10 years, and there was no civil society, and so on.
Can we wrap it there?
Yeah.
I know you have more you'd like to say, but
Just on so what now? Question?
so on. Good.
You probably heard that this resilience is becoming a buzzword. And it's becoming a very popular word. There was just a recent conference on that. And then how that would be integrated into the disaster preparedness, and how that would be integrated into all this climate change debate that is happening. For the European Community Humanitarian Office, ECHO, is committed to enhancing its collaboration with its development counterpart, DevCo, in order to form a joint long-term resilience building programs and not to repeat the development sectors of the past. DFID, meanwhile, is also showing its cards, the DRR, disaster risk reductions, and climate change adaptation integration, and resilience building projects such as with their ongoing BRACE, B-R-A-C-E-D funding program. So the signs are there, for the integration at the level of the humanitarian community. And the intentions are really good across the board. And there's also evidence that suggests that the cost of integration may well be lower than the cost of no integration. And again, the question is, how far would these good intentions go? As Julian was saying, it's a very complex issue. And for us, really the only source of hope, and we're quite lucky because of the grassroots work that we have done from the level of the basic Christian community to the parish, all the way to the diocese. We were able to, and discovered a number of problems, even with the cluster. For example, we rely on the many information that we have. For example, we would say, okay, in this area, one NGO would be in charge, and therefore, the other areas could be covered. But what we're finding now is, in fact, what it means is there's only one NGO, but there's already an assumption that that particular international NGO would have covered the entire barangay, but in fact it's not. So if there's 1,000 victims or survivors in that area, there's only 300. But in the information that you receive in the mapping and so on, well, the International Red Cross is here, the World Vision is here, the Catholic Relief Service is here, Plan International is here. But we need to question that because these are, for example, in the clusters, the parish is not involved in that because the coordination happens within the international community. And I can cite to you so many examples of how difficult it is to actually talk about coordination and integration in the community.
Good. Thank you, Jess. I think what we'll do, if it's okay with people, is we'll go straight to Jim. People need to stretch? They're okay? We'll go straight to Jim, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So I think we'll do to finish at 4. Is there any flexibility on the room? I mean,
there is, yeah. We can 4:15, 4:30.
Okay, so
yeah.
we have room till 4. I mean, many of you may have plans to meet somewhere else at 4, but you may be able to go slightly over time.
Well, thank you.
Take it away.
Presumably we should finish before 4 so that there can be some question and answer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this asymmetrical time frame for presentation will be about a 4 what you're referring to. So I'm going to not dwell on the context and just leave you wondering what kind of baffling situation is not getting media coverage, and you can ask me after if that's important. Just to say, this is the newest country in the world, and it's the biggest humanitarian disaster after Syria, in terms of numbers and magnitude. The country is a little bigger than Ukraine, which has been in the news, but a little bit smaller than Texas. Tens of thousands have lost their lives since mid-December 2013. Over 1.4 million IDPs. That's a little bit larger than the official estimates because they're probably conservative. The majority are women and children. Some 75,000 or so are sheltering within massively congested UN compounds. There's at least 300,000 who have fled other countries. So you've got refugees in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and ironically Sudan, which was to have been liberated themselves from.
And there's still Sudanese refugees in South Sudan as well.
Just realize the complexity of the situation. Three things that, who's our pager secretariat person? Anyway, three things I wanted to bring out. One is that there's Toby Lanzer is the new Deputy Special Representative from the United Nations mission in Sudan, been appointed by the Secretary General of the UN. He's also the United Nations Resident Coordinator for Humanitarian Assistance, and he's also the Resident Representative for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So, on the one hand, it could mean better coordination. On the other hand, maybe he's overstretched. Anyway, just wanted to bring it up because it comes out of the pager teleconferences or discussions that are going on. Brooke couldn't be here today, but mentioned that to me. The other thing is the issue of gaining access to affected communities outside of the protect civilians area. Very big issue. Not immediately clear if Canada and the other international donors can put in a word to say what can we do about it if there's some pressure to be put there. The other issue that she mentioned is, of course, access to communities during the rainy season, the increased costs of or need to use air transportation and not land. And again, this is not, this is just generic fragile conflict 101 stuff. But just to say that in one place, I think it was, I've got it here somewhere, Juba to Malakal or something like that, there are 80 checkpoints, And that's, when the roads are reasonably good, but we're entering rainy season, so with the Nile overflowing and it's all a mess anyway. Not to spend too much time on that. So, this may sound a little, which is now just ended, has been called the Tranquility Month, whatever that is, you say, in order to pre-position humanitarian supplies and enable people of South Sudan to plant their crops, care for livestock, and move to safety, to areas of safety, all in advance of the major rainy season, limiting accessibility and movement. Well, if in fact that has happened, good, but it's ironic in terms of talking about this in the context of a conflict where the cessation of hostilities has not trickled down to the field commanders and the people, and anyway. I just thought that was interesting. So despite the cessation of hostility agreements by the warring parties, the trickle-down, as I mentioned, has not gone through. So there's still sporadic people, groups fighting. One of the principles of good international engagement in fragile states, and I think this is the document that Julian was referring to. One of the principle is do no harm. So continuing to bypass the government in the delivery of basic services will cause harm in the immediate to long term. I'm speaking of the aid industry and the UN system. It may be necessary, but there'll be a consequence to pay. But South Sudanese and international actors are increasingly concerned about the pervasive and destructive impact of corruption. But there is little will to address it. Aid dependency is perceived as a growing problem, and there is increasing competition for staff between development partners and the government, just as there is between international NGOs and local NGOs. which is expected to increase after, well, this was written just before independence, but after independence and during a crisis situation, even more so. Principle 10 of those conflict and fragile states principles is avoid pockets of exclusion. Political exclusion continues to jeopardize the conclusion of political agreement necessary to promote stability. Both government and development partners recognize there are states, sectors, and or population groups in South Sudan that receive insufficient development assistance. I had titled this nominally, where's the title? In the grips of greed, grievance, and poor governance. I couldn't get the extra G in there. South Sudan risks sliding into anarchy and genocide. So why this should be is less well understood, though partly linked to discrimination. You also have unemployment, disaffected youth, particularly young men. It has emerged as a significant threat to maintaining peace. Rapid urbanization will lead to a complicated picture of increasing marginalization and exclusion of the rural poor. So I'm just listing off things here to gain time. Development partners are bypassing the government. There's over 100, and this was written again before independence, over 100 parallel program implementation units. These are all acronyms that I've spelled out for you because your métier is crammed full of acronyms, and it's death by acronyms if you want to get for the layperson to get into it. Anyway, this is largely due, understandably, to lack of government capacity. In terms of managing for results, the focus had been to make the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, the cornerstone, and to demonstrate unity and purpose and alignment with the government and so forth. So the achievement of results in managing risks in the wider development and state building agenda had not been very successfully attended to, and so we're now seeing some of the consequences of that. There are a few mechanisms in place to deter poor performance by any development partners or indeed government entities. Poor performance by the government of South Sudan is in passing key legislation, acting against corruption, enforcing merit-based public service recruitment, or dealing with procurement transgressions suggests a culture of impunity. The donor community has failed to address deep-seated issues of youth alienation, equal access to water and land resources, poor integration of demobilized soldiers, refugee returnees, and not providing a robust and particularly helpful national dialogue space. So I'm going to jump over a few things. I'm going to exclude what Canada is doing because I can give you that afterwards. And I'm even going to exclude some of what the partners are doing, the UN, the Caritas Internationalis, which was referred to by Jess. There's an Action of Churches Together appeal, of which many members of Kairos are involved, and I would argue, with all due respect to the Red Cross, that may be more analogous, the Caritas network, to the Action of Churches Together, but that's bringing too much church into it, maybe. Anyway, the South Sudan Council of Churches, which includes Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, is seen to be, everything else being equal, a player that has some moral credibility and authority and could be exercised more their good offices in terms of peace building, reconciliation, and so forth. Maybe they don't have all the institutional capacity that we would otherwise wish, but there are enough ecumenical partners around to sort of buttress that, and I would humbly suggest that, everything else being equal again, the international community and perhaps even Canada would want to think of them as giving them a more robust platform for the peace building and reconciliation, which is even harder to do, an opportunity to do that. So getting to solutions, such as they may be, that's quote unquote, I don't want to be presumptuous here. Given all this, what should Canada do politically or in terms of aid? What should Canadian NGOs do? So let me just quickly focus on a few bullet points here. The Constitution, and this is what Canada could do, Constitution should say clearly that South Sudan is multilingual, multicultural, and therefore multinational. So I think we take some of this for granted, but in fact it's not conveyed out explicitly enough. Canada could also say more about viable dispute resolution mechanisms, establish a consultative governance body, sort of like the upper house or a body of second opinion, a senate, if you will, that is representatively multi-ethnic. There are more than 60, but I could say 120 language groups with 60 ethnic groups, so it's not just the Dinka and the Nuer. Canada could also say something about the competition by neighboring countries, which needs to be avoided if South Sudan is not to become a proxy territory for different intersectional powers and interests. Uganda came in at the request of the government, and their defense is that they in fact thwarted a potential genocide in Juba, but they're still there, and it may be a sore point, but anyway, better that they come through the multilateral groups, IGAD, African Union, the UN, etc. So for NGOs, it's not excluding Canada as a government, but international NGOs, Canadian NGOs, representation at all levels of, I mean, this is something that they could push for, find the appropriate channels to push this message through. Representation at all levels of government and state institutions must take into account all sectors of society and ethnic diversity in South Sudan. Though it would be dangerous to ignore or discount the role and impact of strong ethnic loyalties, the tribe offers, of course, acceptance, socioeconomic safety, security, sense of belonging. Lessons for Sudan's history demonstrate that unequal access to resources, marginalization, and neglect are often at the root of so-called ethnic conflicts. Well, they're manipulated. They're instrumentalized for political ends. So that may be the presenting thing, but dig a little deeper, and it's these other issues. For Canada and the NGOs, as I said, the South Sudan Council of Churches continues to provide leadership in peace and reconciliation efforts between a number of ethnic groups. One of their main areas was between the Luo-Nuer group and the Merle over cattle raiding, which preceded now the Dinka-Nuer conflict. But nevertheless, they are there, and with the proper buttressing from international and local civil society, they could be a greater player. So just to confess parenthetically, Kairos does support, with the help of its members, the women's program of the South Sudan Council of Churches. So because UN Security Council 1325 and gender justice issues are cross-cutting in the UN programs and so forth, that's an important thing to mention. So I think Jess has alluded to it. This is for all players ensuring IDPs are more self-sufficient. Yeah, it could be providing them cash so that they can in turn meet their own needs and stimulate the local economy. Economic diversification, domestic resource mobilization for nation building, and investment outside of Juba. All important things. So I just wanted to come back to the oil thing. China has been, one of the experiments that we had at CCIC was the Asia Pacific Working Group and the Africa-Canada Forum around China and Africa. I don't know how that was evaluated, if it was a limited or prodigious success, but so this is kind of an interesting grouping here. So this takes it to kind of a new level. But China has sort of been very interested in resource extraction in Africa, among other things, but it's been kind of a handoff in intervening in internal processes. However, since China does, before this crisis, got 5% of its oil from Sudan, essentially South Sudan, since South Sudan retained 75% of the overall pre-independence Sudan's oil. But now that's been a cut in third, so they have an interest in kind of, limiting the damage. So I just wanted to mention that. I have a lot of other material, but I think I'm going to stop here. So if that's not too unceremonious.
No, that's fine. That's good. Okay, many thanks. That's great. I think it'll leave time for questions and comments. So thank you both of you. I'd like to suggest I make one comment and then I put a question out there. The comment is, both of you have talked about this, the importance of communities and community organization. I do think it's a common error made by humanitarian agencies, many NGOs, certainly UN agencies and bilateral donors, is to assume that there isn't already an existing community structure, a system for self-assistance, for self-reliance, for solving problems, for resolving disputes, for providing protection. I mean, every community is already actually there doing stuff, right? And I think there's a real danger of UN agencies or NGOs or governments coming into an emergency on the assumption that there is no existing community structure and either throwing some other structure on top of it which could damage it, or failing to capitalize on indigenous processes and indigenous models. So I think, this is my comment, is I think that both of you talked about this, the importance of community organization. And I think it's when community organization is disrupted, either by a disaster or by foreign intervention, that you start to get the breakdown of these resilience and survival mechanisms. So I think community organizations is important. The question I want to put out there for discussion, maybe for all of you, because we seem to be a fairly religious group here today, which is fine. I think it's very interesting. I have felt for many years that in fact the church, and certainly in many countries I've worked in, I mean Indonesia is an example, not just the church but also the Muslim religious structures. Congo is an example, East Timor is a big example, where the church provides some kind of go-between communities and the state, or communities and elites. And I think that the role of the church is an interesting topic in general. And I think, again, it tends to be overlooked by donor agencies. I'm not talking about the Caritas and Kairos and the faith-based agencies. I'm talking about the existing local church structures and systems of support and community organization and redistribution. And I mean, in many countries, the church is the community organization and the clinic and the school. We all know that. I think the role of the church is interesting. And in both of you describe situations where there's elite control of different kinds. You talked about elites controlling land, controlling, the distribution of the way that certain investments might go. South Sudan is a case study in elites manipulating populations. And I just think it would be interesting to see if we could consider what the role of churches in a sort of generic plural might be to serve as a go-between communities and these elites. So I think it's a dimension that we don't actually, frankly, in the development agency side, talk about very much. So I think it's something you have in common, actually. It's something that your situations have in common, and many others too. So that's just a sort of a comment I want to put out there for people to think about. Can I take questions? Comments, questions? We do have, we've got a good 15 minutes, maybe even a bit longer. And if you do have something to say, then could you just introduce again who you are and direct your question to the person to whom you really want it directed.
Failing which, Jess and I will just follow it up with more material.
Jim, you glossed over what Canada is doing, so here's an opportunity. Can you tell us what?
Well, I'm sure it's doing more than what I can tell you it's doing.
You might be surprised.
Through a forensic examination of their websites and so forth. There have been a number of announcements. I can just get to it here. What does it mean? What does it mean if we can't go directly to it? Canada is providing, I'll be corrected by our colleague here, but 24.85 million to experienced humanitarian partners already operating on the ground, including, I can list who there too, are 11 million to the World Food Program, 3 million to UNHCR, 2.5 to ICRC, 2 million to IOM, the International Organization of Migration, 2 million to the UN Humanitarian Air Service, to 27 locations and more than 200 for more than 200 humanitarian agencies, 100,000 to OCHA, 1 million to MSF, 2.85 to World Vision Canada for WASH, that's with two allotments. Canada is also providing 51.5 million to help the people of South Sudan address long-term food security and livelihood needs, which will help avert potential famine this year and reduce pressure on emergency food assistance requirements, including 20 million to the World Food Program for farm to road work, 11.5 million to the UN Industrial Development Organization for improved fisheries, and 20 million to the World Food Program for food for work, as well as moral support to the South Sudan Human Rights Commission. In terms of Canada's top development priority, it is also contributing 19.9 million for child survival in Warrap State in South Sudan for 600 remote communities through the Canadian Red Cross and through the G8 Muskoka Maternal Child Health Initiative. It's noted that in South Sudan, 2,000 women die from complications during pregnancy and childbirth annually versus how many would you think in Canada? 11. Anyway, is that?
Well, I guess it begs the question, are those agencies, or is any of that money going to community organizations, which is, you both highlighted as part of the solution, which is certainly the transition from emergency to development. That the local community organizations are key, or the local communities are key. Is any of that money, it sounds like there's a lot going to multilateral institutions and white trucks in Juba, quite frankly.
Well, I would assume that for the international NGOs, I can't believe that they would not.
Mm-hmm.
However, I can say that, for example, I assume with Caritas, but also with the Action Churches Together, they're extensively rooted into local groups. So, excellent question, though.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, in terms of the Canadian Red Cross, our implementation modalities go through the local national society, so the local Red Cross or Red Crescent. And generally, they have branches across the country. That's their mandate to operate throughout the territory of their country. So with the MNCH project you mentioned, we are working with the local branches, local Red Crosses, offices in Warrap State and in Juba.
Rob.
Yeah, so Rob Shropshire, Presbyterian World Service and Development. I really appreciated both presentations, and the stark differences that we find, I think, between the Philippines and the Sudan, and some similarities. And just thinking of Julian's question, I think clearly, the church has an important role to play, whether it's the Philippines or the Sudan. And it was, your question was one that I would quite often think about in the earlier part of the 1990s when we were doing development and relief work, and I was working in the Great Lakes region of Africa and in the Horn primarily. But I found the dialogue began to change over time with the end of the Cold War and the onset of NGOs that came with that, the political space that opened up for a period of time, whether it was well, in my experience in Africa. But that whole question of elites and how, we work with churches up until that point, and then our relationships began to broaden after that, not excluding the church, but understanding that even within the church, you were dealing with an elite, but at the same time you had this constituency-based organization, which really gave you access to the community in a way that many others couldn't. So there was an evolution, and yet it's still quite key in the way things work when we're doing relief and development. There were a couple of things that struck me in the presentations, and one is, I'm not sure if I missed it, but I don't think I heard any reference to the question of rights and human rights in terms of the response. And maybe that's a third world when Jess was talking about the development world and the emergency response world, and then there's the human rights world. And while I was working at Equitas, during the time of the tsunami, we had a program that I think in part was supported by Development and Peace. It was doing human rights education in the context of the tsunami and the response to the tsunami, and doing that with community groups, but also with government ministries in Indonesia. And that brought in a lot of the principles that we hear talked about when we're talking about sphere or this or that or the other thing, or even community organizing, but in a very explicit way. Principles of equality, of non-discrimination, participation in decision-making. So non-discrimination being particularly important in terms of gender, but also in terms of minority groups or majority groups. That those things were quite important, and then working with the government ministries, underscoring for them that they had a responsibility to be taking these human rights principles into account when they were working on their own response. So I think that's quite a key thing to underline. And the other thing that really stuck out for me was just the whole question of globalization and how it's a reality today. And I think that neoliberalism, we don't even talk about it anymore, but it's a reality. And at least what I heard while I was on a monitoring visit in the Philippines was that while we were still awaiting the government plan in terms of how it would respond with the millions and millions of dollars that were received, that the plan was going to be to divide the country up into zones and to allow different, not humanitarian actors by and large, but corporate actors to lead the rehabilitation and reconstruction phase in those zones. And quite often those corporate actors were corporations, Filipino corporations with family connections to the elite families, and with no experience in disaster response or development. So we were hearing about public relations firms and other similar firms. And that an interesting approach in that was that one of the ACT Alliance partners also bid for one of those geographic areas after a whole lot of angsting about whether or not it was appropriate for them to go into this circle where it was going to be all corporate actors who were leading the response, but just so that they could have a seat at the table and be part of the dialogue and try to enter into those debates that were going to be happening.
Did it succeed?
Well, it's very new. So, but they did. In fact, I think it was a tendering system that happened, or a call for proposals, and so they were one of the successful bidders, and I think the only NGO actor within that forum. So it was an interesting approach, but. While I was meeting with them, they told me that they spent very many sleepless nights wondering whether or not they should walk into the dragon's den, so to speak, of the corporate world in terms of what the response would be.
Anyway, part of the mandate of the UN MES, the UN operation, is investigating human rights. So some of the other actors don't explicitly call it that, but it may be functionally very close to it.
Right, but different from just investigating the abuses to actually
Promoting it.
utilizing rights-based approaches. And Equitas also has been doing this in Haiti, working in the camps of the displaced, and telling the people there that they have rights, and telling the government officials who are working with them that they have obligations under human rights standards.
UNMISS is primarily investigating abuses under UN resolutions 1325 and the child rights one, which number I forget, 12 something. But they're not really advocating rights-based approaches.
Yeah. And just one thing about the complete marginalization of the government, which is supposed to be as the state actor, the primary duty bearer, and you just see them marginalized, and it begs the question that both of you raised about the potential in the longer term. What does it mean when you
Yeah,
marginalize
but it is
the
tricky,
government like that?
because you
It's
can
very
marginalize
tricky.
the government, okay, that's bad. But when the government is actually committing some of the abuses, then how do you deal with that?
I
I mean, it's like,
It's there, so we have to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the case of the Philippines, I think there have been a lot of good statements, critical of the government and the way the importance of transparency and accountability, the need to accelerate the building, but that's it. It's a general statement, and beautiful ones, and great analysis and so on. But that's where the weakness comes out. That if it's not backed up with really good mobilization, and that if you don't tap the organizational capacity, and in the case of the Philippines, you have a strong civil society, and all you have to do is just gather them together and bring them together, and then what you have are this huge infrastructure that's really just geared to, again, it's not a criticism. I think many lives have been saved and so on. But if that resources could have been used to actually let the people participate and push the government, and when you talk to the ordinary people, they just don't have the chance.